There are demonstrations happening across the country where people feel their freedoms are being taken away. Church services are being continually targeted, while abortion clinics and liquor stores stay open. Are our constitutional rights being ignored? Hi, my name is Steve Stiger with Good Life 45, and it's my privilege to be here today with Matt Staver at Liberty Counsel. Matt is the senior pastor. He's the founder and chairman. He and his wife, Anita, founded Liberty Counsel in 1989. And Matt, I can tell you, I would love for you to briefly talk in a minute about Liberty Counsel and what you all do, but how I think about it for our viewers. I think of Liberty Counsel a little bit like Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 6, when his servant came to him and said, they've got us surrounded, like it's over. And Elisha said, there are more of us than there are of them. And Father, please help my servant see that. And it's really my prayer that our viewers can see and learn about Liberty Counsel, because that's how I think of you. You and the team here do an amazing job of protecting God's kids. And oftentimes we feel like we're outnumbered, but there are a lot more of us than there are of them. So can you briefly just share a bit about Liberty Counsel?
It's amazing. Whenever we are in Israel with groups that we take to Israel, I always read that passage from the scriptures where the eyes of the people were opened, and what happened is on the mountaintops were all God's angel armies, and there's actually a song about that very situation as well. And sometimes when you think you're outnumbered, it may be physically that you're outnumbered, it may look like you're outnumbered, but with God on your side, you're never outnumbered. And so Liberty Counsel, as you mentioned, we started in 1989. Anita and I did, and she's my wife. She's president of Liberty Counsel and general counsel. And it is a religious liberty organization, advances religious freedom all over the United States, the sanctity of human life, and marriage and family, as God designed marriage and family to be. So we're in the courtrooms all over the country, but we also have offices in Florida, Virginia, Washington, D.C. We work on public policy and monitor things that are happening in the nation's capital on the state levels as well. We provide a lot of educational outreaches in addition to being in the courtroom. We do a lot of radio, television, communications, and just to provide that education and information to people about our liberties, but also it's not just legal, because as you mentioned, I also began as a pastor before I was called into the law. And so Liberty Counsel is really a ministry that works within the law and policy, but we also work with a lot of churches all over the country. And so it is a very unique ministry in terms of how God has called it and shaped it into what it is today.
Thank you, thank you. So Matt, we're going through unprecedented times, and we've got this shifting landscape. It's shifted from, am I going to die, to, oh my gosh, is my business going to die, to is our country's economy going to die? I mean, there's just this vast array. There's also a great divide. Some want to wait, some want to push forward, sort of let America be America, right? So there are demonstrations going on in many, many, many states where people feel their rights are being taken away. And so it's affecting nearly everyone in America one way or another. Why is this such a unique situation with respect to the Constitution, not only in our lifetime, but perhaps in the history of our country?
Let me give you an example of that. And we have churches that we're representing in between 30 and 40 states all over the United States. And for example, the governor of New Jersey was asked on a national television program, how did you square the restrictions against churches to the Constitution, particularly the First Amendment? And the governor said, I never thought about it. It's above my pay grade. Well, let's back up. No, when you took an oath of office, and everyone else that reports to you, you took an oath to defend the Constitution of your state and the United States of America. You better well think of that. So our constitutional rights never disappear in any crisis, even a pandemic like COVID-19. There's never a pause button on the Constitution. They never go away. If you look at it as a scale of justice, on the one side is our constitutional rights, and that's, in this case, First Amendment, free exercise of religion, and that the government cannot establish a religion. On the other side of the scale is the government interest, and that would either be greater or lesser at different times. When you have a pandemic and you have the public health issue, the government interest becomes greater, but it never overbalances or does away with the constitutional right. So what we have, for example, across the country are churches that are not able to meet, but liquor stores are able to meet. And you can go into various kinds of stores and buy essential things such as potted plants or garden hoses, for example, or perhaps picture frames. But you can't go to a church in many cases. And we can go into some of the specifics because I think it's helpful for people to understand what has happened around the country rather than just looking at your particular church. And I want people to look beyond your particular church situation as to what you're able to do or what you're doing, and make a decision based upon what we're seeing and what we're experiencing around the country, because it makes a completely different picture. We have over 500,000 churches in America, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, and they range from all different kinds of sizes. Some have only music and a message that can easily be transferred in some of those cases to an online communication. But there's so many other things that a church does that cannot be done online. In fact, the church should be so essential, and I know so many that we work with that fall in this category, that when the church doors close, when the lights go off, the community groans in its absence. And as we go through the program today, I'd like to share you some of those kinds of situations that we see happening and some of the things that are happening with regards to the church and the restrictions being put on them as we've moved through the original 2 weeks of shutdown to now 2 months and in some cases 3 months. That continual goalpost, that goal line continues to be moved. And so the question is, how long before the church should begin to reopen?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, not only is the goal line being moved, but even many people feel that it's being applied unequally, to your point, right? So the Constitution was designed to guarantee equal rights, right? And justice for all. So how is the Constitution supposed to protect us, especially in times like this?
Well, let's look at, say, a Home Depot or a Walmart. And I'm not picking on one of those stores, but everybody knows them, and they are now considered in the essential category, which in itself is an interesting situation that one individual, a governor or a local community official, has the ability to write in or out of existence something that's essential or not, without any documented scientific or constitutional basis. So with regards to some places, let's take Kentucky. We represent a church that on Easter Sunday, individuals that went there, it's a 700-seat sanctuary, they had a very, very small number inside, very far socially distanced apart, and they had other people in the parking lot that wanted to participate in parking lot service in their car. 2 state troopers were sent to the church by the governor of that state, Andy Beshear, and he threatened that this is what he was going to do on Easter. And they took down the license plate numbers of every single person, and they put notices on each car, and these were quarantine notices. A few days later, the governor of the state sent them letters demanding that they go into quarantine, and everyone that was in the car and anyone that they came into contact with, demanding also that every single day at a certain time they take their temperature and report it to the public Department of Health. None of these people have symptoms, mind you. They just parked in a church parking lot on Easter Sunday. To hear the Easter message in their car. They never got out of their car, some of them, and they still got the notices. As a result, some of those people have been terminated because they went back to their job, and it came out in the media that this is what the governor did, and they said, don't you go to that particular church? Yes, I'm a church member. And they got furloughed. Some of them got notices of termination. Now, those same people could have gone right down to the Home Depot, the Kmart, the Walmart, or the Kroger grocery store, and we have photographs of that with the church and comparing that to those parking lots. Those parking lots were packed full with cars. The inside were packed full with people, no social distancing. Those people could have gone to the Home Depot or Kmart parking lot, turned on the radio and listened to their pastor preach. and there would be no problem. But if those same people are now in a church parking lot listening to the pastor preach through the loudspeakers, they got this notice of quarantine and were stigmatized and targeted and humiliated, and some of them were even fired from their jobs. That's the kind of unequal treatment that we're seeing around the country. And there's so many more examples I can share with you. For example, in Washington State, we had to fight for a pastor to be able to even have an online service on Easter Sunday morning. They were being told you couldn't leave your home. Even a single individual couldn't leave your home to go to the church, to use your equipment at the church to do the online Easter service. And we had to fight over that to get pastors the ability to be able to leave their home and go to the church to do the online Easter service. In one county in California, the local county issued an ordinance, an order that says you cannot use wind instruments, only percussion instruments. And this is for the online service. We're talking about a small group of 10 people or less. They could not have a wind instrument, only a percussion. The only time it says you could use a wind instrument is if you did the wind instruments at home, but no more than 4 people, and they all had to be related to the same family. These are people that live in the home. They're blood relatives. What happens if you have 6? Well, they couldn't participate in the online worship service with wind instruments. We also have places, for example, in Virginia, where we represent a church. And there, the church is 293 seats. The governor used a magic number of 10, which has no scientific basis, by the way, that you can't have any more than 10 people. But that same governor said abortion clinics are essential. So you can take the life of an unborn child. That's essential, he said. He also said that liquor stores are essential and all the other places are essential. So you can go there without any limitation. But churches didn't fall in that category, so no more than 10. This particular church does not have internet. Now, I know that may be hard for people to understand, but this church does not have internet. This church has a very special ministry. And it ministers to people, some of whom have been former drug addicts and prostitutes. It helps these individuals in so many ways besides a message on Sunday. These people take some of these individuals to doctor appointments. They give them support and counsel. And they had 16 people on Palm Sunday. 16 people, 6 more people than this 10 magic number. And the police came and they cited the pastor and gave him a misdemeanor charge punishable by up to 1 year in prison and a $2,500 fine. And they threatened that if you come back here again and you have one more than 10, so if they had 11 people, everyone would get ticketed with that same criminal penalty and the fine. So the people were so terrified, they didn't even attempt to come together for Easter. And we're talking about 16 people in a 293-seat sanctuary. So you can imagine how far out they were spaced.
Exactly.
Way beyond social distancing.
Yeah.
And because they had 6 more people than the government said it was okay, the pastor now faces a criminal charge.
How about the arbitrary nature of all this, right? How does the Constitution protect us when there are folks that seemingly just ignore it and make their own decisions, right? I mean, how does the Constitution protect us in those situations?
Well, the Constitution
is supposed to protect us.
Yeah, it's supposed to protect us. The Constitution never goes away. So it never dissipates. Unlike, say, a Home Depot, churches have a First Amendment right to meet and assemble, free exercise of religion. The government cannot prevent the free exercise of religion, cannot establish a religion. And think about this. The government is actually telling churches how to worship. It is imposing a government-mandated orthodoxy, i.e., you only worship online. Well, for some churches, that's not possible. For some people, it's not possible, either because they don't have internet or because they don't have the bandwidth to watch an online message. Or they do things that you cannot do. You can't give somebody food through the internet. You can't give somebody some counsel. You can't find out if they're hurting because they just lost their job and they need somebody to talk to. There's a lot of things that churches can't do online. So you can't just say, this is how you're going to worship, and this is a mandate from the government. That's something the Constitution draws the line, says you don't have that authority to do it. And then they're also telling you that you can't worship in groups of more than 10 in many places. And in New Mexico, it's 5 people. So they're telling you the size and how to worship. Wind instruments are not allowed in some places, percussion okay. Online is only allowed if you do it from home. You can't travel to the church to do it. Online's the only way to do it. Parking lot services are not permissible. Some places they are permissible. The situation I just talked about where they got ticketed and notices of quarantine for having a parking lot service. Some places in Mississippi where they got a $500 fine, each person in the parking lot, while the service was actually going on. The police officers came to each car, knocked on the window, rolled down the window, and gave each person a $500 fine. That's the government telling you how to worship. And the government has no authority to do it. Now, that's what the clear law is. What happens when the government violates it? 2 things. Either they don't get challenged and they get away with it, or they get challenged and there's pushback. And there's been lawsuits in Mississippi that ultimately prevailed against that $500 fine. There's been lawsuits in Kentucky that prevailed against the parking lot ban. There's been a lawsuit in Kansas that the federal court ruled against the government order of that state that says you can only have 10 people. So those have to be challenged, and so that's what we're doing around the United States. And look, nobody wants to put anybody in danger. Everybody knows we're in a unique period of time. There's obviously different things we need to do.
Yeah.
But churches are in the best position to determine how and the best position when to be able to do their services. And here's what other things have happened. It's not just that your Sunday or your Sabbath, for those that are Sabbatarians, message can be broadcast online. Because what also has happened, when the church doors closed, the AA programs that often meet on church campuses, they're gone. The drug addiction and sexual addiction programs, they're gone. The counseling is gone. In many cases, the feeding programs, no more. The clothing programs don't exist. Trying to help someone just with some money, there's no one to go there because the person drives by the church lights are off. Since these lockdowns have happened, there has been a dramatic increase in domestic abuse, child sexual exploitation, online broadcast, child pornography, exponential increase in viewing pornography online, depression, anxiety, an increase in prescription drug medication, illegal drugs, and even suicide. Now, more than ever, the church is absolutely essential. And it's no business of the government or a single individual just to wipe it off the map and assume that churches are not essential. They've always been essential, but they're more essential now than they ever were before.
So who has the final answer when you think about federal versus state? Because both have kind of weighed in with different decisions, right? Who has the final answer with respect to the Constitution?
Well, with respect to the guidelines, you know, the president has been issuing guidelines. Those are not enforceable. Those are guidelines that the individual states do. And so those individual states have enforced them at different levels. Then within each individual state, you have counties or cities getting involved in sometimes making their own guidelines. In Florida, for example, on April the 1st, Governor Ron DeSantis stated after a pastor that we represented was arrested, even though his service was approved by the sheriff of Hillsborough County, Florida, he was then arrested for doing what the sheriff actually approved him to do. 2 days later, after his arrest, Governor Ron DeSantis declared that attendance at churches, synagogues, and houses of worship is essential activity, and then overrode all the other counties to the contrary. So you have these differences within different states. But with regards to the Constitution, let me give you an example. In the cases that we litigate, it's both federal and state. So when we file a lawsuit on behalf of the church, say in Kentucky or Virginia or these other cases like in Kansas, you have both the First Amendment and there's both clauses at work. Free exercise of religion. The government cannot, and that includes state and local governments, prohibit the free exercise of religion. Mm-hmm. And the government cannot establish a religion. In other words, they can't declare what it deems to be orthodox and not orthodox. Can't tell you how to worship. All of those are at play. But you also have the state constitution that has a similar freedom of religion protection. And you also have some state laws like the Religious Freedom Restoration Acts that are passed in individual states. So you have both state and federal laws that are applicable, and some of these courts have relied upon both, and some have relied upon one versus the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How about, let's go back to churches and maybe some dimension around this, right? How many infringements on our religious liberties are you and Liberty Counsel defending at this point? I know it's many. And how many victories for God have been produced so far?
Well, we're in more than 30 states, maybe closer to 40 as we continue to move through this. It's incredible. And we would be in all 50 states. It's not that the other states don't have any problems. They're very similar, except for South Dakota. It's different. That's one of the states that had very few regulations at all from the state. But we're in most of the states. Many of these are just resolved by trying to walk through. Like, for example, the Washington state, that didn't have to be litigated. It was close to being litigated. And we were able to get that changed by working with the government there and threatening litigation, and it was changed on the eve of Easter. Others are having to be litigated, like the ones I mentioned to you already. Mm-hmm. The problem is having the bandwidth, because we are more stretched now than ever before. We could have probably filed hundreds of cases if we had the actual human personnel capability.
Yes.
But each one of these take a very significant time to put together. And there are so many all over the country. So what we're doing is looking at different ones in different places of the country that can begin to set precedents not only for those states, but also be used outside of those states as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Can we go back to elected officials? Mm. What can they do in these situations, and at what point do they start treading on our rights?
Well, you have both federal, state, and local capabilities of declaring a state or national or local state of emergency. Mm-hmm. And those usually come into play during natural disasters. And in Florida, we're familiar with that because of hurricanes. Yes. Yes. And you have tornadoes, you'll have flooding different places around the country, or fires, or something of a natural disaster. Everybody's familiar with that. And in some places, for example, when we've had hurricanes in Florida, you might have in a certain place a curfew. That's in part because they don't have any electricity, and so it increases the possibility of crime and looting when people are not in those damaged buildings. Mm-hmm. So every one of us have lived through that, and they have some additional authority to be able to address that specific situation when a declared emergency is in existence. But those are typically isolated, even in a state such as Florida. They're isolated in their size, perhaps maybe several counties, not the whole state typically, and they're temporary until the electricity gets back on or till some of the power lines get moved off of the road. Then you can start traveling again. Even after 9/11, when we had those emergencies, we didn't have these long shutdowns. The difference with this one is they've declared the same powers under these states or times of emergency. Mm-hmm. And it becomes open-ended. And unlike anything else before, where if in a place such as a hurricane, you can still go to work, or you can still go to the grocery store if they have a generator or if they have electricity. Now we've had something different that we haven't had before. We didn't even have this after 9/11, where this massive shutdown across the country has happened. And then it's gone on long beyond the original projection of a couple of weeks. So we're in brand new territory where there hasn't been a lot of testing. And so some of these court cases are testing that. And some of the individual elected officials are starting to realize the Constitution still exists. You still have to operate within a constitutional framework. Freedom of assembly, petition of your government, freedom of speech, free exercise of religion. You can't establish a religion, the right to trial by jury, the right to speedy trial. All of those things still exist. And you have to balance that, but you can't just ignore them and sweep them off the table. And so in situations where that has happened, those challenges are being done. On the other hand, it's so pervasive this time that there's not enough resources to challenge everyone.
Yes.
So once we get through this process, I think it is incumbent upon us to go back and look at model legislation across the country so that people are reminded, even in a state of emergency, no matter what it is, you cannot override individual constitutional rights. You have to do a balancing, but the constitutional liberties and rights do not dissipate.
Okay. In the midst of all this arbitrary, in some cases, rights being ignored, all of this confusion, these separate camps, stay, move forward, I love how God works in all of this. So can you speak for a minute about the reopened church?
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that is just amazing amidst all this din of confusion and noise, how that happened, right?
Well, that is amazing. That came about as part of prayer. It came about thinking about how the church is essential and must be essential. So essential that when the church doors close, the community groans in its absence. So we have a website called reopenchurch.org, and it is encouraging churches across America to begin the process of reopening. Not open like you used to, but begin with health precautions, limited services, combined perhaps with parking lot services, combined with online services as well. And we have guidelines there for churches to follow at reopenchurch.org.
Well, I think that may be most of the time we have today, but I just want to tell you, Matt, as a friend and a brother in Christ, I want to thank you for listening and having the courage to make yourself available to God's call in your life. How He has worked through you and the team here at Liberty Counsel is breathtaking, and at the same time reassuring to all of us. It's amazing. I just love how God works, and when we make our hearts available to Him, what can happen, in this case, over 30 years. So I just want to thank you.
Well, thank you.
So friends and viewers, I pray that you will come alongside this great ministry. I hope this has been informational and has shown you a glimpse of the amazing work that they do every day, and how they really work to protect God's kids, each of us and our families. And I really pray that you will come alongside them to help them do this amazing work that they tackle every day. Thank you so much.
Another original production from Good Life 45, where hope happens.